Well, I tried to fight it off, but eventually it's got me. I knew it had happened sooner or later. I struggled against the inevitable, but it had to happen. I had to fall, and I finally started thinking about running a second campaign. Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries. I'm John. Unfortunately, I'm not joined by my wife Hannah today. She's at work doing the late shift, and I'm not going to bore you with our sort of struggles to get our work schedules to sync up. Now both of our jobs have changed, which are making it more difficult to record podcast episodes together. But suffice to say, we're still working on it. But I just wanted to put something out about something that I've been thinking about a bit recently in the RPG arena. And if you've listened to the introduction, which I'm assuming you have because you're here, you might have thought, well, what's the big deal, John? You want to run a second campaign? What's the problem? Well, it's sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Myself and my friend Johannes, who runs the Burning Wheel game I play in and is one of the players in my Smoke and Snow campaign, we often joke about the fact that we're locked into this sort of GM cycle where inevitably, because we both have like restricted amounts of free time to run games in, we'll start off and we'll be running like a couple of games. And then as the months go on, inevitably we'll start going, oh, do you know what? I haven't really got time to run 2 games. Rather than keep both of them going and just sort of chugging along, I'd rather cancel one of them and start and just focus on one of the games and make that as good as I can. And then that's what happens, and everything's fine for a bit. But inevitably, after a while, you start sort of looking around and you're like, do you know what? I've got some free time. My first game's going well. I'm on top of my prep. Pretty much it's almost running itself. Do you know what? I think I've got enough time to fit in a second campaign. And then your mind inevitably starts thinking, well, what can I run for this second campaign? And you start coming up with these fantastic ideas, looking into game systems and stuff like that. And the cycle repeats itself again. And I'm not saying this to try and shoot myself in the foot or like put people off playing in my future campaigns, because, you know, we're always striving towards that goal of getting games that you can run within the available time and prep appropriately, not too much, not too little, for the games you want. And I think, to be honest, with my Smoke and Snow, and I might just be deluding myself, as I've said previously with the cycle, but I like to think with my Smoke and Snow campaign, I'm pretty much getting to that level. Now, this is helped by the fact it was set up with that in mind from the start. It's a hex crawl. I've got a lot of the areas sort of pre-populated, or at least with outlined stuff, so if the player characters threw me for a loop and were like, oh, we're going to go here, then I could easily pull something out based on the outlines I've got and happily run it without stressing too much about the prep. They've recently gone into the Dolmen Wood, which is like in a pocket dimension, accessed via portals in my campaign. And obviously Dolmen Wood is like pre-planned out. I've got the worm skin zines and the Patreon pre-release stuff from Necrotic Gnome. So a lot of that is planned out for me. I've just got to tweak it a little bit and run with what I've got. And that's been helped by my old mucker from the old Purple Worm days, Pete Jones, putting me onto a great little app called Obsidian Notes, which has enabled me to use like Markdown wikis to easily record my notes. So that's making it a lot easier. And my prep's got to like probably the most streamlined level it's ever been. And as is often the way, I've started going, well, I only run that game every other week, every other Friday. So that means I've got the Fridays between those free. I could slide another game into those Fridays, surely. Now, I'm not naive enough to think, I could slide another game into those alternate Fridays that requires an immense amount of planning, but I've recently been looking into the idea of point crawls or slightly more episodic games. And as I was thinking about that, a few sort of things I've been looking at recently. So I've been looking at my copies of like Barbarians of Lemuria. I was talking to Jason Connolly of Nerds RPG Variety Cast, and it's got me thinking about the idea of swords and sorcery. Now, I love a swords and sorcery story myself. I've got my big faux leather bound book of Conan stuff, but to be honest, outside of like Conan and a few others, I don't really know a lot about the genre. But what I do know from those books and various films that I've seen, I quite like. And I was thinking, you know, I could probably run a more episodic campaign set in a sort of swords and sorcery background. So first of all, that got me thinking about, well, what are the sort of tropes or the elements that I associate with Swords and Sorcery. And as I say, I'm by no means an expert. If you want to call in and drop any more knowledge about Swords and Sorcery or recommendations for things I should read on my head, feel free to do so. If you don't know how, there's details on how to contact me at the end of this episode. So the tropes I associate with Swords and Sorcery are settings largely being humanocentric in terms of the player characters and the heroes. I mean, you tend to have like your villainous sort of serpent men and stuff like that, but by and large your heroes are human, or mostly human with a little bit of something on the side of it. The protagonists tend to be sort of like outsiders, although there are sort of civilized areas. They don't tend to like fit into those, whether that's the mighty feud barbarian or whether it's a thief dwelling on the outskirts. Whatever, they tend to be people who are sort of outside looking in, and they move through those societies even though they're not technically a part of them. The protagonists are normally motivated by their own self-interests rather than any sort of innate heroism. So whether that's looking to steal an ancient gem from a sorcerer's keep, or rescue a nobleman's son for a rich reward, it tends to be based around the idea of I'm doing this to get something concrete that will benefit me, rather than I'm doing it for some sort of abstract morality or larger ideals of heroism. Also, there are the tropes, as I said earlier, of serpent men, ancient empires, often sort of fallen Atlantis or Lemuria style empires that once had great technology and magic, and their hubris spelt their doom, but now the wreckage of their ruined empires lies around for those brave enough to find it. There's also the idea, which conflicts with your sort of standard fantasy sort of D&D style campaign, that there is something innately off or evil about magic and enchantments. Now, what this is can vary between different sort of fictional sort of worlds and milieus, but, you know, whether it's you have to bargain with demons to get powers, whether it's in the sort of older Dark Sun D&D campaign idea where it despoils and defiles the land as you use it, leading to great harm, but you still getting that power. So, you know, an abstract idea of, oh, this might harm the world in some way, but in the short term, I'm going to get some power. I mean, you only have to look at the modern world to see how that's shaking out. And I suppose the last trope I'm going to discuss briefly, because I don't want this to be like a massively long episode, is an idea that I first saw sort of codified in, of all places, D&D 4th edition. And before all the haters start banging on about 4th edition, what I'm talking about is the points of light setting. And I'm not saying 4th edition originated that by any means. I'm sure it was a thing long before then. But it's the first book I remember reading personally where I sat down and read it, and it was presented in a no-nonsense sort of, here's the idea that we're running with. And if you're not familiar with it, the points of light is basically, there's these rare little points of light, whether they're cities, bastions of civilization or whatever, that are safe or civilized in this world. And the rest of it is in darkness. It's a wilderness. It's chaotic. It's wild. It's haunted by monsters. And I think that really sort of, from my experience, tends to be true in Swords and Sorcery. You tend to have like 2 or 3 like big sort of city states, whether they're sort of noble civilized states but with some sort of like dark secrets inevitably, or whether they're full bore like villainous cities of thieves rolled over by evil sorcerer kings. They tend to largely be sort of civilized, whereas outside that you have the wilderness that's haunted by outlaws, monsters and stuff like that. And there's a very clear line between those two sort of opposing poles, at least in my view of Swords and Sorcery. So, as I've been thinking about this, I've been looking at various games, systems that I might like to run it in, and just for my own personal preference, I'm trying to find a game system that doesn't stray too far from D&D, because with the best will in the world, I'm not saying there aren't other game systems out there that you can run Swords and Sorcery with, of course there are, but for my money, because I'm trying to create a campaign that's like minimal extra like research and planning for me, I don't want to have to learn an entirely new system. So I've been looking at a few that are sort of D&D based, you know, like 13th Age, which I like the icon mechanics in, which is like a bit of a 3.5 sort of 4th edition sort of tangent. There's obviously Worlds Without Number that Kevin Crawford's just brought out, which is like the fantasy version of his Stars Without Number game. There's what else have we got? There is, of course, Barbarians of Lemuria that I mentioned earlier, and I know that Jason Connolly of Nerds RPG Varietycast is a big fan of. I've also just downloaded a game based on Black Hack, which is called Black Sword Hack, which is specifically designed to sort of jury rig Black Hack 2nd edition to work using swords and sorcery. I've not had a chance to read through it yet. If you get a chance to look it up on, it looks pretty promising there. If you get a chance to look it up on drive-through, I think it's like $4 or something like that, you know, so you can't go wrong for a PDF with that money, can you? It's pretty much black and white, digest, a layout, has the full rules in it, so you don't even need Black Hack to run it, and it's got various things like spells, twisted science, demons, summoning, rune weapons, advice on creating swords and sorcery worlds, which all looks pretty good. To be honest, I'm going to delve into this in a bit more detail. Hopefully over the next couple of days I'm going to be reading through that to see what I think. Because one of the things I have noticed is that a lot of the sort of ostensibly swords and sorcery games, whether that be Hyperborea, Barbarians of Lemuria, or whatever, they tend to come sort of like baked in with an existing background. Now, I've run Hyperborea in its much longerly titled previous edition, since the hardcovers of the new edition haven't gone out yet, and very much enjoyed that. And I did just sort of strip the background out of that and run it in my own world. But I felt in doing so, because the game was so sort of tied into its background, I wasn't really getting the full sort of Hyperborea experience. I'm not saying we didn't have a good game, because we did, but, you know, I just felt like I wasn't really running the game how it's intended to be run. And when I look at my other games that are in a similar vein, like Barbarians of Lemuria, Crypts and things and stuff like that, all of them have their own background and they're pretty much tied into them. Now, that's great. And you may say, well, surely that's a good idea, John, because you don't want much planning. So that'll save you a lot of planning if you don't have to come up with a game world. And you are absolutely right, amorphous listener who sounds suspiciously like me. You are right. It would save me a lot of work, but also it would deny me one of the most enjoyable elements for me personally as a GM when I'm starting a new campaign. And that is creating the campaign world. And to be honest, I don't look at that as being lots of additional work, because I tend to do a very like top-down approach, where I might be like, oh, okay, so we've got 3 kingdoms in this game setting. Here's what they're called. Here's the sort of rough flavour of those kingdoms. Where are we going to start? Here. You then define the start area in more detail, and you don't need to define everything else in more detail until the player characters start exploring it. Which, if it's going to be an episodic game, you know, you have a bit more control over where things are going to happen and what adventures they're going to do. So I think that'd be fine. But I really love coming up with campaign worlds, taking ideas from the players as well and incorporating them and feeling like together you've created something that's greater than the sum of its parts. But like I say, a lot of sword and sorcery RPGs seem to come with their background intact, whereas your more standard D&D, yeah, you could go Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or whatever, but you can just take it and run it in your own world. And yeah, I suppose I could just adapt like Old School Essentials or something like that to run a Swords and Sorcery game in, but I feel like I'd have to tweak it pretty extensively to do that, because people in Swords and Sorcery campaigns tend to be a little bit larger than life, you know, a little bit more powerful. I suppose a little bit more on the 5th ed sort of scale of things, but although there's nothing wrong with 5th ed, it's not really the system for me. So I'm looking at this Black Sword Hack as a possibility. Obviously, I've got Black Hack, the default version. I've got White Hack as well, and a few other games I'm looking at, and we'll see which one tickles my fancy at the end of the day. So thank you for listening to this little ramble of mine. If you've got any ideas of additional tropes that I should be cognizant of concerning the swords and sorcery genre, if you've got any suggestions for other game systems that might be good for it, but remember, I'm looking for something that's fairly similar to D&D, then please do get in touch. You can do so a few different ways. You can leave me a voicemail message, either using the SpeakPipe or Anchor apps, and there'll be links in the description of this show, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and whatever you're playing, have fun.